Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? This time we're tackling one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic.
It really is, and we've got a ton of fascinating sources to dig into. YouTube videos breaking down all the theories, historical records, even an account from someone who lived on Nikumaroro.
Nikumaro.
That's the island where some folks think we might have landed. I bet most people listening have heard the basic story of Amelia Earhart.
Right, famous pilot, vanished in the middle of the Pacific.
Exactly. But trust me, there's so much more to uncover.
I'm all yes.
Buckle up, because we're about to unearth some seriously mind-blowing details.
Sounds good to me.
So picture this. It's 1937, and Amelia Earhart, already a legend for her solo transatlantic flight, sets off to fly around the world.
Ambitious.
Talk about ambitious. This was cutting-edge stuff. Long-distance flying was still in its infancy.
And the technology back then, especially for navigation, wasn't exactly what we have today,
No kidding. They were relying on radio waves.
which, as we know, can be a bit finicky.
That's putting it mildly. Okay, so Amelia's final flight. It was supposed to be this triumphant moment.
Right, a celebration of human achievement and all that.
Exactly. But things took a turn. Pretty quickly, actually. She ran into much stronger headwinds than anticipated over the Pacific.
Oof, that's not good.
Definitely not. I mean, we're talking serious impact on fuel consumption and overall flight time.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, things were about to get complicated. And to add to that, communication was a huge issue. There were all these attempts to warn her about the headwinds, give her updated info about her position. But it seems like a lot of those messages just never got through. Imagine that. You're in the middle of the Pacific, totally reliant on these radio signals.
And they're basically useless.
Pretty much. It's almost like, trying to have a phone conversation with someone, but with a really, really bad connection.
Except the stakes are a bit higher than a drop call.
A bit higher, yeah. And then there's this whole thing about her plane's antenna.
Antenna.
Yeah. So after a previous crash, they actually removed the long-range antenna, the one specifically designed for, long-distance communication.
Ah, I see the problem.
And direction finding. I'm no expert on this stuff, but that sounds like a pretty big deal to me.
It is. It is. To understand why, though, we kind of have to understand a bit about how radio waves actually work.
Okay, break it down for us.
Well, think of it like this, right? You've got these waves, these radio waves, traveling through the air, and the antenna is like a net trying to catch those waves.
Okay, I'm following. A radio wave net.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The size of the net, or in this case, the length of the antenna well, it has to match the size of those waves.
So a shorter antenna.
Means you're less likely to catch all those radio waves, especially, over really long distances.
Gotcha. So Amelia's already dealing with these unexpected headwinds, unreliable communication.
And now a potentially bad antenna situation.
Exactly. It's not looking good.
No, it's not. And to make matters worse, the atmosphere itself can really mess with those radio waves.
Really? How so?
Well, think of it like trying to see through a heat haze. Everything gets distorted, blurs together.
So Amelia's radio signals could have been all messed up because of that.
It's definitely a possibility. And when you combine that with a shorter antenna...
Yikes. A recipe for disaster.
Yeah, pretty much.
So Amelia's flying into this, pretty challenging situation.
Yeah, not ideal.
Not ideal at all. So as she gets closer to Holland Island, that tiny island she's aiming for in the Pacific.
Right, her intended refueling stop.
Exactly. Well, things get even more tense. She's low on fuel. And despite all these desperate attempts to contact the Itasca...
The Coast Guard cutter, right?
Yeah, the Itasca, the one stationed near Holland to help guide her, and, well, she just can't seem to find the island.
And that's where those haunting final messages come in, right?
Man, yeah, those messages, it's like you can hear the desperation in her voice. In one transmission, she says, "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low." It just, it sends chills down my spine.
It's a really powerful reminder of just how crucial accurate navigation and communication were back then. I mean, if those radio signals were even slightly distorted or misinterpreted...
The searchers could have been sent in the completely wrong direction.
Exactly.
So was that it? Was it just this series of small mishaps, technical issues that ultimately sealed her fate?
Well, that's one of the big questions, and that's where the different theories about her disappearance come in.
Right, the theories. The crash and sink theory is the most obvious one, I guess.
Yeah, the simplest explanation. Low on fuel, plane crashes into the vast Pacific, disappears without a trace. Makes sense given how big the Pacific is and the limitations of, search and rescue technology back there.
Totally. But there are other theories out there, some even more intriguing, I'd say, like the castaway theory.
Ah, the castaway theory, the idea that she might have landed but on a different island.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So the theory goes that, unable to find Howland, Earhart might have spotted Nikumaro Island, It's a coral atoll, part of the Phoenix Islands.
Okay. And what's so special about Nikomoro?
Well, for one, it could have acted as a makeshift runway, at least during low tide.
Interesting.
And here's the thing, there's been some evidence found on Nikomoro that seems to, well, support this idea.
Okay, now we're talking. What kind of evidence?
We're talking a partial human skeleton, a campsite with sign that someone had been struggling to survive.
Wow.
And get this, a shoe sole that seems to match the type worn by Earhart.
Wait, a shoe sole. That's pretty specific.
It is, but there's a twist. The shoe sole, while the same style, it was too large for Earhart's foot.
Huh. So was this whole castaway theory just like speculation then?
Not necessarily. We have to remember, we're talking about evidence from the 1930s, right? Luckily, though, groups like TIHAR, the International Group for Historical Aircraft Recovery, they've been taking a fresh look at all this old evidence using modern techniques.
Oh yeah, TIHAR. I've heard of them. They're doing amazing work. They've organized so many expeditions to Nikomoro, haven't they?
They have, and when they re-examined those skeletal measurements, this time using a much larger database, they realized actually the bones could belong to a taller-than-average woman of European descent.
And Amelia Earhart was pretty tall for her time, wasn't she?
She was, so that piece of evidence suddenly got a lot more interesting.
Okay, now you got my attention. So if she did land on Nikomoro, how long could she have survived? And I mean, wouldn't someone have found her?
You would think, right? But here's the thing. That campsite, it wasn't actually discovered until 3 years after Earhart vanished, when the British were surveying the island.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so it's possible she survived for weeks, maybe even months before, well, succumbing to the elements. No food, limited water, exposure. It's pretty bleak.
That's both incredible and incredibly sad. Stranded on a remote island hoping for rescue. But what about those radio signals? I've heard about all these distress calls that were picked up for days after she disappeared.
You're right, there were a lot of reported signals, some picked up by experienced radio operators, others by, well, amateur enthusiasts.
Like ham radio folks.
Exactly. There was even a housewife in Texas who claimed to have heard Earhart's voice, saying she was down on an uncharted island.
A housewife in Texas, wow. That's quite a range for a radio signal.
It is, and you have to keep in mind that radio wave propagation back then, meaning how those waves travel, it wasn't as predictable as it is today.
Right.
Signals could bounce off the atmosphere, get distorted, fade in and out.
So how do we know for sure that those signals were actually from Earhart? Couldn't they have been hoaxes? Or just, random interference?
There's always that possibility, of course. But TIHAR, they did some incredible work. They analyzed over 120 reported distress calls.
Wow, that's a lot of signals to sift through.
It was, and they determined that at least 57 of them were credible, meaning they couldn't be easily explained away as something else.
Okay, that's pretty significant.
It is, and here's the really interesting part. The timing of many of these credible signals, it lined up perfectly with low tides on Nikomoro.
Low tides, why is that important?
Because that's exactly when a submerged plane's radio might be able to function.
Wait, hold on, back up a sec. Submerged plane.
Right, so if Earhart did land on Nikomoro, it was likely on the reach at low tide. But as the tide came in, the plane could have been washed into deeper water.
Makes sense.
And this actually connects to another piece of evidence, that aluminum panel found on Nikomoro in 1991.
Oh, I heard about that. What's the story with that panel?
Well, Tyre believes it could be a patch from Earhart's Electra. The dimensions, the rivet patterns, they seem to match.
Really?
Yeah. And they even had a forensic imaging specialist examine a 1937 photo of Nikomoro.
A photo from 1937. Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing what technology can do these days, and they think they can see the landing gear of the Electra sticking out of the water, right where Emily Saley marked it on a map years later.
Hold on, who's Emily Saley?
So Emily was a carpenter's daughter. He was just a child, living on Nikomoro with her family back in 1940.
Okay.
And years later, she told Tyre that her father, the island carpenter, pointed out a plane wreck to her. She said he told her, "See that wreckage? That rusty old stuff out there? That's an airplane."
That's incredible. And a little creepy, to be honest.
It is, but her memory from decades earlier, it matches up with where Tyler thinks the plane might have gone down.
That's wild. So we've got this aluminum panel that might be from Earhart's plane, an eyewitness account from this carpenter's daughter, and all these radio signals that could be linked to Nikomoro. That's starting to feel like a lot of coincidences, don't you think?
It does, doesn't it? But we also have to remember that we're dealing with a lot of circumstantial evidence here, and there are still a lot of questions that need answers. Like, if Earhart did land there, why didn't the U.S. Navy find her plane when they searched the island?
That's a great point. Didn't they fly over Nikomoro just a week after she disappeared?
They did, but those Navy pilots, they were mainly looking for a downed aircraft on the beach or in the water. They didn't have the technology back then to do a really thorough underwater search.
Ah, I see.
And here's another thing. The pilots actually reported seeing signs of recent habitation.
Habitation, like people living there?
Yeah, they assumed the island was being used by, like, coconut harvesters or something.
But it turns out that wasn't the case at all.
Nope. Tyre later confirmed that Nikomaro had been uninhabited since 1892.
So what were those Navy pilots actually seeing then?
That's a mystery. Some researchers think those signs of habitation could have actually been remnants of Earhart's campsite, debris from the plane or even distress signals she had set up.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that those planes might have flown right over her so close, but she couldn't signal them.
It is. And I mean, even if the Navy search missed her for whatever reason, wouldn't someone have picked up those radio signals and, traced them back to Nikomaro?
You'd think, but remember, radio direction finding back in the 1930s, it wasn't exactly a precise science.
Right. Plus, those signals were probably weak, intermittent. It wouldn't have been easy to pinpoint their source.
And wasn't there also just less of a, I don't know, a sense of urgency back then compared to how we handle missing persons cases today?
Oh, absolutely. It was a different era. It seems like the whole search for Earhart just kind of faded from the public eye pretty quickly.
That's strange to think about.
It is, isn't it? And it's part of what makes this mystery so fascinating. We're trying to piece together these events from over 80 years ago using evidence that's been scattered, reinterpreted, debated.
It's like a giant, really complex puzzle.
Exact.
Okay, so we've got the aluminum panel, the carpenter's daughter's eyewitness account, the credible radio signals, the fact that the Navy might have totally missed her campsite. But let's play devil's advocate for a minute here. If Earhart did manage to land on Nikomaro, wouldn't we have found, like, more concrete proof by now? I mean, wouldn't there be something more definitive?
That's a fair point, but we have to consider the environment we're dealing with here. Nikomaro is a remote, uninhabited island. Exposed to harsh weather, the terrain is tough.
Right.
And we're talking about an aircraft that potentially went into the water over 80 years ago. The ocean's really good at hiding things.
True. And Tiger hasn't given up on the search, right?
Oh, absolutely not. They've been using all kinds of modern technology to try and find more evidence, sonar, remotely operated vehicles, even manned submersibles.
Wow. It's amazing how technology is letting us revisit this mystery. What about that shoe sole we talked about earlier? Haven't there been some attempts to analyze that further?
Yeah, they have. Tyhar went to great lengths to track down records from the shoe manufacturer. They compared the sole to photos of Earhart's shoes and, well, the good news and bad news.
Oh.
The good news is they were able to confirm it was the same style of shoe. The bad news, they found that the size 9 shoe was too large for Earhart to have worn.
Ugh. It's like every time we get close to a solid answer, something throws us off track.
I know, right? But it shows just how dedicated these researchers are. They really want to find the truth.
I admire their persistence. But I guess for now, the shoe sole remains a bit of a mystery.
It does. But hey, who knows? Maybe that one definitive piece of evidence is still out there, just waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, that's an exciting thought. But before we get too carried away with that idea, what about those other theories we mentioned earlier?
You mean like the bye-bye theory?
Yeah, the spy theory. I gotta admit, I haven't really heard much about that one. What's the thinking behind it? Yeah, the spy theory. Fill me in. I haven't really dived into that one.
So the spy theory basically suggests that Earhart's flight, it wasn't just this daring adventure, it was actually like a secret mission for the U.S. government.
A secret mission, huh? Intriguing. What would be the purpose of that?
Well, the theory suggests that she might have been gathering intel, spying on Japanese activity in the Pacific.
Wow, high stakes.
Definitely. And this theory, it really gained traction when a photo surfaced, supposedly showing Earhart and Noonan, her navigator, in the Marshall Islands.
A photo? That sounds like pretty convincing evidence, right?
It would be, except, well, research revealed that the photo was actually from a Japanese travel book published before Earhart even disappeared.
Oh, wow. Talk about a misleading clue.
Yeah, it was a big red herring. It just goes to show you how important it is to, scrutinize every single piece of evidence and to be wary of confirmation bias.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in a theory and, only see the evidence that supports it.
Exactly. Okay, so besides those big 3 theories, the crash, the castaway, the spy, are there any other ideas floating around out there?
Right. Are there any other explanations people have come up with?
Well, there are always those who believe that maybe Earhart disappeared intentionally.
Intentionally. Like she just wanted to, I don't know, start a new life somewhere.
Right, exactly. Maybe she wanted to escape the spotlight. Or perhaps she was, involved in something I wanted to keep secret.
It's easy to let the imagination run wild with a mystery like this, isn't it?
Oh, totally. But those theories, they're mostly speculative, no real evidence to back them up.
Right. So it sounds like the most likely explanations are those 3 we've talked about, the crash and sink, the castaway on Nikomaro, or the spy theory. Although maybe that last one is a bit less likely.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment. And, what I find so fascinating about this story is that it's about so much more than just trying to figure out, what happened to a plane and its pilot.
I agree. It really makes you think.
It makes you think about the limits of technology, the risks people are willing to take, and the enduring power of human curiosity. I mean, look at us. We're still talking about this over 80 years later.
It's true. And for me, going through all this information, it's really made me appreciate the challenges Earhart faced. I mean, flying across the Pacific in the 1930s, that was no easy feat.
Absolutely. We're talking about navigating by the stars, relying on those unreliable radio waves, making split-second decisions with very limited information.
It really highlights the mental fortitude she must have had.
Oh, for sure. It's a good reminder, though, that sometimes even the best laid plans,
They can go
they
wrong.
can go wrong, and that even with, incredible courage and determination, there are some forces beyond our control.
And that sometimes embracing those unknowns, pushing those boundaries, is what makes life interesting.
I like that. It also emphasizes how important clear communication is, right? And being adaptable when things don't go as planned.
Very true. Lessons that are just as relevant today as they were back then. So after all this digging into the evidence, are we any closer to solving the Amelia Earhart mystery?
Well, the honest answer is maybe. We've looked at some compelling evidence, but there's no smoking gun, The official explanation, it's still that she crashed and sank in the Pacific. But, I mean, those radio signals, those findings on Nikamaro.
They can't be ignored.
Exactly. And the possibility, however slim, that she survived as a castaway. It's both heartbreaking and, I don't know, strangely hopeful in a way.
I get that. I have to admit, part of me, it still hopes that one day we'll find that one piece of evidence, that one discovery that rewrites the story.
I feel that. But even if the mystery remains unsolved, the journey of searching for answers, it's taught us so much about aviation history, about the complexities of communication.
And about the power of science and research.
Exactly.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this whole deep dive has been a renewed sense of awe for Amelia Earhart, for her courage, her pioneering spirit.
That's beautifully said, and I think a lot of people share that feeling. She continues to inspire us, even though her still ended in such a tragic and uncertain way.
She does. So for our listeners out there who are just as fascinated by this mystery as we are, what's the next step? Where do they go from here?
Well, I'd say dive into those sources we used for this deep dive. Explore those YouTube videos, read those historical accounts. You might just find something that sparks a new idea or reignites that fascination with Earhart's journey.
And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will uncover that missing piece of the puzzle, the one that finally solves the Amelia Earhart mystery. Until then, we'll keep searching, keep exploring, and keep the spirit of Amelia Earhart alive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.